friends, it's Dan. Welcome back. Welcome to another Paint and Chat. This is our October edition. This will be our third Paint and Chat in the series where I'm going to go through and usually I'm just going through and base coating some miniatures, kind of going in assembly line format, and we'll be rambling about a subject. So in this particular one, I guess let me start by saying I'm tired. If you're watching this in real time, or if you've been watching these videos in real time, I've done about a review a day. I think for at least the last week. We had the Blood and Plunder range. We had Maelstrom's Edge from Spiral Arm Studios. I'm working through. I've now done half of the box that Victrix sent to me. I guess half for me. You haven't seen the other one. I actually did another review that I'll be uploading tomorrow. So I've done half the Victrix box. I've got a very large box from North Store that's on the way, and actually Firelock very generously reached back out after the first couple of reviews I did and said that they would like me to review some more stuff. So it's all great news for the channel, great news for my hobby in the long term, but I get, I don't know, maybe like 45 minutes a day of hobby stuff, and if you're wondering what the hell I'm doing, I'm cleaning up. Like, some of these models have been sitting around for a minute now, so they've got some like cobwebs on them, so I'm just cleaning them up before I start painting. But I get like maybe an average of 45 minutes a day for hobby time, and that's for anything hobby related, including miniature reviews. And I'll tell you, I enjoy doing reviews. I really find them fun. Like, it's sort of like a natural extension of the hobby for me now. But it does mean it's an opportunity cost. It means that I can't paint miniatures if I'm spending 100% of my time doing reviews. So in the short term anyway, there's going to be an imbalance there. I'll be doing pretty much all reviews, certainly for the next couple of months probably. So I thought I'd take just a little bit of time to myself here to base coat some miniatures. What I'm painting here today are, I sculpted them as Lothar Seaguard, so the base miniatures are the Oathmark Elf Infantry. And I did a conversion video where all I really did was glue some bow accessories to their backs and then sculpt on with a little bit of crude green stuff work there, some sashes, to make them look more like the Games Workshop Seaguard. But I think the end result's pretty cool, and what I'm eager to try out here is a painting technique that I discovered. I'll put a link down in the description to the video of a channel that I just subscribed to who does some hobby work. He was painting up some late Romans, and I was specifically looking for that content because I think my goal for 2026 is going to be to do my Arthurian late Roman army. That's going to be what I'm going to focus pretty much all of my hobby energy into. So we'll just kind of make get some more there. We'll make it a kind of project log series for the year, see how much of it I can get done. However, I really wanted to figure out a way to paint them. I didn't want to just razzle dazzle them all. And so I found this guy who does a painting technique that almost seems like it's a perfect inverse of what I do. Normally I'll base coat colors with some thinned down paints, do a heavy wash, and then maybe some, highlights on things like metal, some white areas. He does the opposite, where he actually starts out with a wash as like a shade step, and then using contrast or speed paints will pigment it. So it seems like it ends up with a cleaner version of what I've been doing. So I'm eager to try it out with these elves here. And if it works, then by extension, that's what I'll be using on my Arthurian project next year. So that's where we're headed. I'm going to be base coating in, this is Corax white with some regular white mixed in, so it makes for a slightly lighter white color because there's some areas where the primer didn't completely coat. So I'm going to hit just the areas that I want to be white, like the shield, like the robes, because these are going to be painted up like traditional Seaguard, even with the shields that I hate with the dragon on the front, but I think it's pretty quintessential for Seaguard, so I'll be doing it that way. So I'm going to hit those areas in white first, just to make them a nice bright white color. I'll then hit it with my Agrax wash, and then I'm going to come back in with some colors to kind of pigment some areas, maybe do some later layer highlights. I won't be able to get that all done in this video, of course, but that's the direction I'm headed in here. So, the topic that I'm going to be rambling about today is the tariff situation in the United States. And I normally avoid political discussion. I think for many of us, we are fatigued by political discussions and the, apparent anyway, divisiveness within all of our countries, I think, at this point. But I'm based in the United States, so most of my experience is with the U.S. political situation. And so I don't normally talk about politics because I think for many of us, we're looking for an escape from that when we come to our hobby and to YouTube hobby channels. More specifically, we're not looking for political discourse or discussion. And so I was kind of wary of doing this video, but the subject is starting to affect me in some ways that I'll get into, and my hobby, and so I thought this is going to definitely start affecting some of you. So I wanted to offer just some insights on the situation in as, it will be biased because we all have our own biases, but as unjudgmental a way as I possibly can. So if you, for example, are in favor of the current U.S. tariff situation, there's no judgment here. There's no antagonism here. I'm not. I'll just lay my cards on the table that I'm not a Trump supporter. However, many in my family are. In fact, I'd wager to say most people in my family are. And so there's no judgment against you personally. You don't have to have your guard up for this video. There's going to be no attacks on you or even on the Trump administration. Because I think that we can have civil discourse. If we disagree on policy, it's easy to have civil discourse without it resulting to personal attacks. Now, where we might differ is going to be on matters that have like ethical considerations, like immigration policy, things like that. I'm definitely not going to touch that because, as I said, that's more ethics, morality, emotions, right, that are behind those kinds of arguments. Whereas with tariffs, I can approach it purely from a math standpoint. So there's going to be a lot less emotion. There's still going to be bias, I'll freely admit that, my own perspective on things. However, again, this will be civil, it'll be non-judgmental. It's just going to be sort of some high-level thoughts on the current situation, how I think it's going to impact us, and maybe what we should be doing instead. So with those kind of disclaimers out of the way, if you're completely unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, the U.S. has currently now, under the Trump administration, we'll see how this video ages, because again, this is now October of 2025, and things move pretty quickly these days. But as of this moment anyway, we have a tariff policy that is kind of irregular. It has evolved substantially over the past even 10 months, or 9 months really, since Trump took office. And it started out with kind of a salvo of flat tariffs against a whole lot of different countries. Then it went down, then it went back up, and some countries still have, or all countries really have, some kind of tariff in place, albeit not as high as what it once was. So I guess some groundwork here. If you've watched the channel, you'll know my background's in accounting and economics. That's what I do professionally. And so I do have some insights into this that I think might be of help. I guess it helps to define what a tariff is for those that are only maybe passingly familiar with it. And that's a tax, a levy on imported goods. So in a simple example, if there's a 10% tariff in place against products coming in from the UK into the United States, again, if it's a 10% and I buy a $100 good, there's going to be a 10% tax that has to be paid the moment it crosses the threshold into the United States. And that's something that's handled by our customs agents. And the question of who pays it is one that is, it seems like hotly debated online. However, and I think the reason for that is because the answer is kind of, it depends. The strict answer is that the importer pays it. The person who is bringing the good in, or their broker, essentially, is the person who is paying that 10% tariff. Again, sticking with our simple example of a $100 good with a 10% tariff coming in from the UK. So I guess I will tell you about what's happened to me specifically is that I had some goods come in from the UK that I had to pay import duty on, which is not like a woe is me kind of situation. It is what it is. However, like that's one instance where I did have to pay directly a tariff for the goods coming in from Wayland Games specifically. Is I had to pay it in order for customs to release the items to me. And you see stories about that with people that maybe buy things from some like horror stories, frankly. I see it on like TikTok, Instagram, that they'll buy like $100 good, and suddenly as soon as the good hits customs, they get a message about having to pay like $1,000 tariff on the good, because that tariff was not listed on whatever company website they bought it from, because it technically doesn't exist until it crosses the border. However, when I say that it depends in terms of who pays it, is because some companies will take that into account when it comes to shipping their goods. So Victrix is a good example of that, where if you buy something direct from Victrix and you're based in the United States, you as the importer will not have to pay that duty because Victrix pays it. However, they've raised their prices to accommodate that. If you're based in the United States, you're going to see a different price than if you're based, for example, in the UK. So, the other option is in the instance of companies that are essentially importing to themselves. So this would be like your Amazons, this would be your Games Workshops, to stick with the model-centric world, where when Games Workshop ships something to themselves, say from their warehouses in the UK to their warehouses in the US, if you're based in the US, your supplies, your miniatures that you buy are coming from the United States because they've already been shipped here ahead of time and are warehoused here. However, that tariff was paid, again, the moment it crossed the threshold into the United States by Games Workshop. So as with Victrix in my prior example, Games Workshop paid the tariff in order to get it here. And you can bet that Games Workshop is raising their prices to accommodate that. And so that's the main concern that I have is, again, I actually understand, let me back up for a second. For those who voted for this, are in favor of this economic policy, I completely understand the position, the perspective of, I want something different. The status quo is not working. Prices are too high. And I think that's a general issue around the world, but the United States in particular, we have very high inflation at the moment. Less inflation actually than some other countries, but that's not the point. We do have high inflation. And a lot of that is a rebound effect from COVID supply issues, and of course companies then taking advantage of the situation and raising prices beyond what they needed to. However, what we're going to see in the short term with this tariff policy is the price of goods are just going to go up, because they must, because as I just described, somebody is paying, whether it's you directly or the company, and I guess there are going to be instances where the company does not pass the cost on to the consumer, but I think we could all see, you don't need a degree in economics to know why that's going to be rare for a company to not just eat a tariff, especially when we're talking about some of the higher tariffs from countries like not the UK, which I think is 10%. However, in the short term, we're going to see just the price of goods go up. If we're lucky, only by the amount of the tariff. However, as we know from experience, a lot of companies will, as I said, take advantage of the situation and raise prices higher than they need to in order to offset the increase from a tariff. So I was talking about how I understand why people would want this superficially, that you are in favor of change. You're not in favor of the status quo. You thought, let's just shake some things up. I get that. And the truth is, there actually are legitimate reasons for tariffs to go into place. And I think some of them are becoming more outdated in this era of increased globalization. But there are legitimate reasons why you might want to have tariffs in place. The concern that I have is not just the short-term price increases, because that's sort of just inevitable when it comes to any kind of tariff policy. The main concern that I have with the United States' current approach to tariff policy is that it's not clear to me, and not seemingly clear to anybody that is even within the administration who would be responsible for articulating this. It's not clear what the end game is. And I guess to kind of prove that point, or do my best to support that point, it would be helpful to explain what are the legitimate reasons that you might want to put tariffs in place. Because there are really four. There's like some nuanced reasons, like sub-reasons. But really there's like four main reasons why you might want to put a tariff in place. And the first one is, I think, the most justified, which is a retaliatory tariff. So say, for example, I guess we'll stick with the miniature world just to keep it light. Let's say, for example, that the UK had a 10% tariff on imports of miniatures from the United States to the UK. And the United States said, well, that's not fair. We're going to hit you back with a 10% tariff until such a time as you drop your 10% tariff. In real world terms, this mostly applies to things like automobiles, or if anybody else has any kind of like protectionist policy for things like steel production. If, say, China has a 50% tariff on imported United States produced vehicles, a retaliatory tariff would be that we then, in turn, say any vehicles imported from China to the United States also have a 50% tariff. Again, I think that kind of tariff policy does make sense because it's usually targeted. It's clear what the end goal is, which is you remove your tariffs, we remove our tariffs. And so you can see there then the goal is the removal of tariffs. It's an inherently anti-tariff policy because I'm trying to get you to get rid of your tariffs, and then I'll get rid of mine. It's clear to me that's not exactly what the goal is here, or at least maybe that's part of the problem, is like different countries, we have different goals, and we are applying a uniform solution when the goals should be different based on the country. So it can't be retaliatory, exclusively retaliatory, the reason we have these tariffs in place, because a lot of these countries that we've put tariffs on don't have tariffs on us. We already had free trade with many of these countries, or the tariffs that we've put in place are disproportionate to the tariffs that were put in place on us, and because they're blanket tariffs, they're not targeting a specific industry, right? It would make sense if we said, China, you have a 50% tariff on imported or exported, but imported into China, US made vehicles. So we're going to put a 50% tariff on imported Chinese vehicles. That's not what we did. We said, here's a blanket tariff, again, for all countries, whether there's already tariffs in place or not, and regardless of what industry they're affecting. So these aren't retaliatory tariffs. But the second reason that you might want to put tariffs in place are protectionist, right? This is another stronger argument that there are certain, I guess like going back to the foundation of our country anyway, the United States, a majority of the way the U.S. government levied its income was through tariffs on imported goods. And a reason for that was in part because we wanted to protect our kind of like fledgling industry, right? We didn't have much industry in the way of like textile production, for example, and so we had to build that up. And the only way you could do that and make them competitive was to basically artificially increase the price of European textiles. I'm just giving that as a simple example. So protectionist policies make sense when you're trying to support a U.S., in this case, again, U.S.-centric position, but a U.S. industry from foreign competition. Again, that's becoming less and less pertinent in this globalized era. However, the other reason, this is kind of like a subcategory of protectionism, is in the instance of national security. One thing that's been brought up pretty frequently is like the production of microchips that the U.S. has the position that it's a national security threat to have those exclusively, or almost exclusively, produced abroad. And that's a problem because that could be leveraged against us, or in a time of war, we don't have any capacity to produce our own microchips. However, it's clear to me, for the reasons that I listed in the retaliatory tariff section, that these also aren't protectionist because, again, they are blanket tariffs, and which is to say that they're not to protect, say, a textile industry or a U.S. steel industry, I guess in a more modern example, because they're not specifically targeting foreign steel, they're targeting everything. And because of the unpredictable nature of them, there's no guarantees for a U.S. company that if they were to ramp up, say, production of U.S. steel, that they would be protected indefinitely. That's also the problem with this, because it's essentially being done by executive order. There's no longevity to them. If you are a U.S. steel producer, you're going to be wary of, providing massive increases to your U.S. steel production, because you don't know if tomorrow these tariffs that are making that affordable or making you competitive are just going to disappear. And that's why we haven't seen, even though these policies have been in place now for 9 months, we haven't seen any real investment into U.S. industry. We've seen lots of people claiming they will, but they haven't done it. And it's obvious why they haven't done it. You can't blame them, because they don't know if tomorrow they're going to wake up and it's suddenly going to be gone. And when it comes to national security investment or industry, that's something that also requires some kind of government intervention as well, right? Because that's the same issue. Is like nobody wants to start up a U.S.-based microchip producing company or ramp up their existing one because of the same reasons that I just mentioned when it comes to steel production, right? Because I don't know if tomorrow these tariffs are still going to be in place, and if therefore my business is going to be solvent or viable. So at least if the intention is protectionist trade policy, it's not being done in a way that is most efficient for protectionist trade. And then the other one that's brought up is that it is revenue for the government. It's just to levy taxes, as again our government did back in the 1700s, almost exclusively. However, that implies two things. One is that the tariffs will be in place indefinitely, because that's the point of them, is let's raise money, raise revenues from the sale of these goods. It's not a short-term policy, it's an indefinite policy. Because it has to, in order to raise revenues, they have to stay there. And that is opposite of protectionist policy. Again, the best arguments I've seen are that they are retaliatory. Again, maybe like China, stop putting tariffs on our imported goods and we'll take tariffs away from yours. Again, I don't think we're doing it in an articulate way if we're just slapping universal tariffs against them. However, that implies that if China were to drop their tariffs, we would drop ours, right? However, you can't then simultaneously claim, look how much money we will make on these tariffs if you're saying that you're going to drop them at some point. It's the same thing with a protectionist policy, because a protectionist policy implies that the tariffs are going to be so damaging to the imported product that it will protect our US-based business. Let's stick with microchips for a second. If we're saying that by putting these tariffs in place to ramp up US microchip production, we're going to make foreign microchips so unappealing from a price standpoint that people will instead buy US microchips. Great in theory, right, for US-based businesses, but that also means people are not buying foreign microchips. And if they're not buying foreign microchips, they're not paying the import duties, and therefore the government is not levying taxes, right? So it can't be any combination of those three. If it is purely just to levy taxes, really what it should be is a across the board but very small tariff that would not be in any way like something that would make it appealing for a U.S. business to ramp up their own production. It's basically just like call it a 1 to 2% tax on imported goods that's just there, right? It's so low level that nobody even pays attention to it. Nobody changes their buying habits. That would be the only way that like a constant or consistent revenue source would make sense. I'm going to switch now. I've basically base coated everything I want in white. I'm going to, again, trial this out. I'm going to basically just wash the whole model in my Agrax Earthshade mix here, and then eventually layer on some colors, but I'll see how far I get here. And then I mentioned too that there are 4 reasons you might want tariffs, or a aggressive tariff policy. And the 4th is for use as a negotiation tactic, right? It's basically like putting a gun on the table in diplomatic terms and saying, look, you're going to do X, or I'm going to have these tariffs stay in place. I think that this is probably what we're trying to do with this tariff policy. And as I said, I think I've seen arguments for all of the other 3 that I've mentioned, but for reasons that I just outlined, I don't think those arguments are particularly strong, because again, you can't say the tariffs are both to levy goods or levy taxes and revenue for the U.S. government and to protect U.S. industry. It can't be both of those things simultaneously. So the best argument is that this is a negotiating tactic, which makes sense given the administration's background. Again, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, I'm approaching it purely from an economic standpoint. Again, non-judgmental as I can, best as I can. So again, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, I think as just a pure negotiating tactic, it makes the most sense. It also suggests that it's the kind of thing that they want to go away entirely. Again, maybe with a 10% tariff, they're trying to say that's the low rate at which we would just levy taxes indefinitely. However, I would argue that a 10% duty is high, especially when you're talking about goods that are, over $1,000. Suddenly, right, you're paying an extra $100 on that good just because it came from the UK. Anyway, going back to using it as a leveraging tool, the problem is it's not working. And the evidence that it's not working is that in the time since these tariffs have been put in place, we've had very little renegotiated deals in the U.S. There have been some that have been touted that have been essentially just like rehashes of what was already in place, right? But the end goal isn't clear. And so I imagine, again, there's definitely conversations going on behind the scenes that we're not privy to, and I appreciate that. However, I think the disadvantage that we're at is that using it as a negotiating tool, I think only really works if you're targeting one country at a time, right? Because imagine you're in a room with 180 people and you basically say to all of them simultaneously, you're going to do what I say or else, right? That, even as the United States, the economic powerhouse that we are, that inherently isolates you, right? And basically there's 180 people are going to start looking at each other and saying, what? Like, maybe we'll find a different solution here to our existing trade agreements. So I think that's my fear here, is despite all of the claims that this is due to reasons 1, 2, or 3, I think this is really just reason 4, that we are trying to use this as leverage to get something probably non-tariff related out of the countries that we are trying to negotiate with. And again, the problem with that is if the countries don't acquiesce, then you don't get anything. You just end up with an indefinite tax on a good. And so, yeah, the concern I have is that's what we're seeing with, again, fortunately we're talking about miniatures in this case, but obviously there's massive impacts when we're talking about raw materials like steel, like lumber, like food, right? That has real world impact on people. However, in the miniature world, what that likely means, at least as it relates to miniatures imported from the UK, is that they're just going to be more expensive for the United States. And in turn, if the UK has retaliatory tariffs in place, like blanket retaliatory tariffs, it means that goods, miniatures, produced in the US and shipped to the UK are going to be consequently more expensive there. And again, there's companies like Firelock Games is based in the US, Wargames Atlantic is based in the US. And make no mistake that even if it's the same issue but in reverse, that even if, for example, Wargames Atlantic has warehousing in the UK, and they do, for distribution in the UK. It's the same issue again, but in reverse, where they have to pay the duty the moment it enters the UK, and therefore are very likely to pass that cost on to the consumer, just as Games Workshop would be here in the US. So that's my fear here, is that because this is, I think, a leverage game in the long term, it's going to just translate into an indefinite tariff, or semi-indefinite tariff, until such a time as it just gets removed, either by this administration or the next. So the price of miniatures is just going to get higher, again, if we're lucky, only by the amount of the tariff, but we know from experience in this age of inflation and shrinkflation that companies often utilize these kinds of situations to get more money, kind of under the cover of increased costs. So take a company like Games Workshop. Does anybody believe for a second that if they have a 10% increased cost of goods in the US, that they're going to increase the cost of their product by 10%? I don't. Again, especially as a publicly traded company, I don't think that's going to be the case. And then the big concern becomes that even once tariffs then disappear, if the cost of good has gone up, if the price of goods have gone up, can anybody name a time where companies then lowered their prices even once their costs decreased? So say, again, there's a 10% import duty currently on, again, stick with Games Workshop just because they're the biggest Games Workshop products. They increase prices by, say, 15% to offset that, and then the tariffs go away. Do you think Games Workshop then decreases their prices by 15% or even 10%? No, they don't. So what this will translate into, I fear, for the US is kind of shifting goalpost, because it's not clear. Again, that's my biggest concern with the tariffs, is not even ethical concern, as I just laid out. There's several reasons why you would want to have some kind of tariff policy in place. The concern I have with it is that it's not clear what we're trying to achieve. And I think, as I said toward the beginning of the video, the answer is it varies from country to country. However, we're using a blanket tariff policy to approach what should be a more nuanced conversation. And there you have it. So I guess what frustrates me is, in the short term, again, it's so sad for Dan that I'm paying import duties on products that I'm getting from the UK, and that is what it is. And it's hard for me to say that that's really bad for me, because for the most part I'm getting these miniatures for free. So that's not the issue, right? I'm only concerned because if I'm paying this, then everyone is paying this. Everyone in the US is paying this, and many of you are paying for the miniatures on top of the import duties. Then you've got unrelated, or I guess semi-related issues. Like, I have a box from North Star that's actually been sitting with customs for a week now, like exactly a week today. And I've been reaching out trying to figure out what's going on with it, but it hasn't been released, and there's no indication that it's going to be released shortly. And if it's just a matter of paying a fee, like, I'll just pay the fee, but I can't get through to anybody to figure out what's wrong. So you're going to end up with stuff like that too, right? Because you've got this extra layer now that needs to be addressed anytime something crosses the threshold into the US, to figure out whether the import duty is paid, needs to be paid. It's just going to naturally slow things down. Especially, I feel, for the manufacturers of products within the UK, or miniatures within the UK, and the Pewter Belt, as I just learned it was called, or in the area around Nottingham, where so many companies are based, shipping to the US, because while you can just raise the price of your goods, you're going to see some decrease in sales, just naturally. So that happens anytime you raise the price of a product. So you're going to see some decrease in sales. And actually, there's a calculation you can do to figure out, like, what's the perfect price of a good. That's getting into the weeds on accounting, but or economics more broadly. You can actually calculate, like, what's the perfect price of a good based on anticipated sales volume versus price, and how much revenue that will yield you anyway. So fun times. Curious to see how things evolve here in the coming months and years. And I hope, in terms of like where things sit, in terms of costs, that we've kind of hit the apex of it, that things aren't going to get worse from a tariff situation, and that they can only improve from here. Anyway, I don't know what the solution is. I think that's why I enjoy miniature and miniature painting so much, and I don't think I'm going to make a habit of political paint and chat videos, but I thought this one was relevant. As I said, it's affecting me, so I think that eventually it's going to be affecting you. And I'm curious to see how it evolves. But in the meantime, try to be kind to each other. Please be kind to each other in the comments. And again, my family is a good example of knowing that even if you disagree with each other politically, you can still find a way to talk to each other. And I think much of the like ultra hate maybe that both people sense on any side of the aisle, coming from what they perceive to be the other side, is in a lot of cases manufactured or anecdotal. Because when you actually sit down and talk to people, they're not as extreme, regardless even of who they voted for, right? They're not as extreme as the internet makes them out to be. So remember that. Again, assume the best in people. And assume, when maybe you disagree politically, not that the other person is inherently evil. Don't assume the worst in them. Yes, there are bad people out there. Yes, there are people who maybe want to hurt you, right? But they're rare. They are the anecdote. They are the anomaly. So don't assume that everybody that you're dealing with is the anomaly. Assume the best in people as often as you can. I found that's gotten me far in life. Anyway, enough political discussion. Because the truth is, there's not much to do about it right now, is there? Except educate, learn as much as you can, and vote when the time comes. And that goes for you guys across the pond as well. Because we're all fighting our own issues, aren't we? But the one thing I hope we can agree on, if you're here watching at the end, is that this hobby is a great way to unwind and to escape from all of that. So I don't think I'm going to make a habit of political discourse videos, but this seemed relevant and timely, and I hope I made it as inoffensive as possible. I'm curious to see how these miniatures turn out. I think I am going to end up finishing them, just to see how this technique works, so that I can make a decision about whether it's how I'm going to paint up my late Romans, my Arthurians. So on that note, I'm going to have 4 more, because again, the third one is filmed, but you haven't seen it yet. I'm going to do 4 more late Roman videos, followed by, hopefully, some North Star videos, as soon as I can get this box released from customs. And then, as I mentioned, I also have some more Blood and Plunder reviews to do here in the short term. So that'll be probably the next month or 2 of activity here. So stay tuned for all of that if any of that interests you. But I appreciate you all, really do. Appreciate you dropping by for this one in the meantime. And until next time, happy gaming.